The last people who dared enter the Blackwood Manor never came out, and whatever they found inside remains hidden. I'm your host, and I'm going to tell you their story today. There once lived two lovers named Thomas and Abigail Blackwood. They loved each other more dearly than life itself, and the only thing more special to them than their love was their home, Blackwood Manor. The manor was huge and old, but the couple did not see its age as a flaw. It represented their history and memories that they had made there. They planned to spend the rest of their lives here, and they did. But a few years later, tragedy struck. An epidemic spread throughout the country like wildfire, taking everyone it could catch. Thomas and Abigail were extremely careful, but unfortunately, they could not avoid getting sick either. When the Grim Reaper came knocking on their door, they knew their time had come. But even in death, they wanted to stay together. So they decided to get buried alive in a coffin next to each other in the basement of their beloved home. When the coffin was lowered into the basement, they were terrified but excited to be reunited with each other in the afterlife. However, their joy would not last long. While digging the gravedigger found some bones and accidentally dropped one. The bone hit the side of the coffin and woke up the dead couple. They started banging on the coffin, screaming for help. But when the gravedigger heard their screams, he assumed it was part of some morbid ritual and ran away as fast as he could. All alone again, Thomas and Abigail decided to wait until they were found so they could find peace. But as time went by, they started running out of oxygen. They banged on the coffin as hard as they could, hoping to be saved. But the persistent sound only brought them more misery. Eventually, they fell unconscious, only to be awoken again by the sound of digging. The coffin was being dug up, and this time it was not by accident. Instead, it was because the whole area had been sold to some developers. Their plan was to renovate the area and make money off of it. However, their hopes of making some easy cash were dashed when they found the coffins of Thomas and Abigail Blackwood. They had no idea what to do about the discovery. One of them suggested calling the police, but the others argued that it would only mean unwanted attention. After some convincing, they agreed to call the police and let them handle the situation. The cops arrived and, after hearing the case, decided to bury the couple again. But this time, instead of putting them in a random unmarked grave, they would be laid to rest in the graveyard near the Blackwood Manor. While the developer saw this as a hassle, he didn't want to risk bad luck coming to his project. So he agreed to let the couple be buried in peace. However, that peace did not last long. Every night, the workers reported hearing the sound of footsteps, chains dragging, and muffled screams. No one wanted to continue working on the project, so the developer was forced to abandon it. As the years passed, the manor got run down and overgrown by nature, turning into a decaying shell of its former self. It also became known locally as the House of Screams. Despite this, many curious visitors still dared to enter the house and find out if the screams were real. Some claimed they experienced unexplainable events, such as cameras suddenly breaking, flashes of unknown apparitions, and even hearing the muffled voices of a couple in love. Meanwhile, the two lovers in their coffins were growing restless. They had been trapped there for so long that they were tired of waiting to be free. Instead, they decided to haunt the living so they could move on peacefully. And it worked. Soon, no one dared go anywhere near the manor, even during the day. It was just as the couple wished. But one day, a group of teenagers dared to enter the house. They searched everywhere and soon realized that something was behind one of the walls. They destroyed the wall to reveal a hidden room behind it, but it was empty except for two coffins. Excited by their discovery, they opened the coffins to see if there were any skeletons inside. When they opened the first coffin, they found a woman's skeleton dressed in old Victorian clothing. And when they peeked inside the second coffin, they found the skeleton of a man dressed in similar clothing. It was obvious who these skeletons belonged to. The bones must have gotten loose over time, which is why they kept hearing chains dragging. But they didn't know there was a third coffin. After the boys fled in terror, the spirits of Thomas and Abigail combined and formed into one spirit. The 2 coffins were destroyed, so it now had nowhere to go. Angry and confused, the spirit wreaked havoc on the house, causing intense storms, earthquakes, and floods. It wanted revenge on the boys for destroying their eternal peace. Over time, the house's owner fixed the damage, but he decided to take preventive measures. He locked the house and put up a sign saying it was closed off to visitors. Decades later, a mysterious individual named Arthur Crawford came to the house. He was an ambitious young architect who saw the house as a challenge, a chance to restore an old building to its former glory. But he did not know what kind of danger he was in. Before entering the house, Arthur studied it extensively. He saw that the house was well maintained, and the only damage done to it was because of nature reclaiming what was once hers. He knocked on the door, but when he got no answer, he simply walked in. He heard chains dragging and felt the ground shake under his feet. But he was not scared. Instead, he was excited. He thought that maybe he could use the house's history as a selling point, saying it was haunted. He believed that whatever ghost was haunting the house was harmless and he could befriend it. However, he did not know that he was in for a big surprise. As he continued exploring the house, he noticed that most of the rooms were empty. However, in one of the rooms, he found a diary. The diary belonged to Abigail Blackwood. She wrote about her and her husband's life in the house, as well as her plans to be buried next to him when she dies. Then there were some entries about how she and Thomas would be spending eternity together. The last entry read, "Today is my wedding anniversary. Oh, how I wish I could be reunited with my dear Thomas. Maybe one day we will be." Arthur closed the diary, saddened by their sad story. He made a mental note to include their grave in his restoration plans. As he explored the rest of the house, he noticed a large wooden door hidden behind a bookshelf. Intrigued, he pushed the bookshelf aside and tried opening the door, but it was locked. Curious, he searched the room for a key and eventually found one hidden behind a loose brick. When he unlocked the door, he found himself in a dark room. He walked forward and noticed a pair of coffins ahead. Thinking that this was the final resting place of Thomas and Abigail, he decided to open the coffins. To his shock, they were empty. Confused, he searched the room, but couldn't find them. Just when he was about to give up, he found a secret passageway behind one of the coffins. He entered the passageway, which led him to an underground chamber. There, he found a woman sitting on a stone throne. Her appearance was horrifying, like a shriveled prune with glowing red eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Frustrated, she gestured for Arthur to follow her with her finger. She led him deeper into the underground where he found 2 coffins. One was clearly newer than the other, and the woman beckoned for him to open it. Arthur obliged and found his own body lying inside. He was confused, but before he could ask any questions, the woman shoved him into the coffin. Then she locked it. "What the hell?" Arthur screamed. He banged on the coffin, but it was no use. The woman approached the other coffin and signaled for him to look inside. When he did, he found the spirit of the Blackwoods inside. "Welcome," it said in a raspy voice. "We've been waiting for you." And that is the end of the story. If you like this creepypasta and you want to hear another one just like it, then be sure to click on the video on the screen right now. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. With that said, I'll see you next time. Is this just a tale whispered by the wind through the trees, or a truth still echoing in that dark wood? You decide. It all began when Arthur, an ambitious young architect, took on the project of his career. Arthur was tasked with restoring a Gothic Victorian mansion, abandoned for over a century, in the forested wilderness of Maine. Locals in the nearest town spoke of the mansion in hushed tones, claiming it was cursed and that those who ventured there never returned the same. Arthur, however, dismissed these stories as mere superstitions of a secluded place. The mansion stood isolated, a skeletal silhouette against the perpetually gray sky. Its ornate gables and crumbling turrets hinted at a forgotten grandeur, now shrouded in a chilling silence. Inside, cobwebs draped like ancient tapestries. and dust motes danced in the sparse light that pierced the grimy windows. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of decay and damp earth. Arthur, armed with blueprints and a flashlight, saw only the potential for architectural triumph. For the first few weeks, Arthur was completely absorbed in his work, dismissing the unsettling creaks and groans of the old house as the natural sounds of an aging structure. Yet, as the days turned into nights spent alone in the mansion, a subtle shift began. He'd catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that seemed too distinct to be tricks of the light. Faint whispers would drift from empty rooms, just at the edge of hearing, like secrets shared by the very walls themselves. He tried to rationalize them, blaming exhaustion or the unsettling silence of the isolated woods. One afternoon, while inspecting the mansion's oldest wing, Arthur stumbled upon a hidden door. It was seamlessly blended into the ornate wood-paneled wall, almost impossible to detect unless you knew exactly where to look. The door was secured with an ancient, heavy iron bolt, caked in rust. Its carvings were unlike anything else in the mansion. Darker, more grotesque figures interwoven with arcane symbols that sent a shiver down his spine. The few remaining workers, hardy locals accustomed to the strange tales of the region, visibly recoiled from it. "That door ain't meant to be opened, mister," one old carpenter muttered, his eyes wide with an unspoken fear. "Some things are best left undisturbed." Arthur's curiosity, however, was now thoroughly piqued. Why was this particular door so meticulously hidden and so fiercely sealed? Arthur's fascination with the door quickly morphed into an obsession. At night, he dreamt of the door, its unsettling carvings twisting into grotesque faces. During the day, the whispers in the mansion grew clearer, more insistent. Sometimes he thought he heard his own name. Other times, fragmented words echoed in his mind like release, us, rest. The workers, unnerved by Arthur's increasingly distracted and pale demeanor, gradually abandoned the project, leaving him utterly alone in the sprawling, creaking mansion. One stormy evening, no longer able to resist the pull, Arthur stood before the locked door, a crowbar in hand. The iron bolt was thick with rust, but unyielding. He struck it with all his might. Each clang resonated through the mansion, as if the very house cried out in pain. The whispers intensified, morphing into frantic, voiceless screams inside his head. "Don't!" But Arthur pressed on. With one final, forceful blow, the ancient lock shattered with a deafening crack. The door groaned open, letting out a breath of air that smelled of ancient rot, damp earth, and forgotten time. The odor made Arthur's stomach churn. He shone his flashlight inside. To his surprise, the room was utterly empty. No windows, no furniture, nothing but bare, crumbling walls. However, directly opposite him, a massive, covered object stood draped in black velvet, reaching from floor to ceiling. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door behind him slammed shut with a thunderous roar. He spun around, frantically trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. His trembling hand raised the flashlight back to the covered object. There was no other choice. He approached cautiously and gripped the edge of the velvet shroud. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he ripped the covering off. Beneath the velvet was not a cabinet or a sarcophagus, but an antique, full-length mirror, its frame blackened with age and neglect. Arthur stared into it, frozen with a chilling realization. The reflection looking back was not his own. In the mirror stood a man uncannily resembling him, yet his eyes were wide with terror and desperation. The man's clothes were old, belonging to another era, perhaps a century ago. The reflected man wasn't looking at Arthur, but beyond him, into the dark corner of the empty room. Slowly, Arthur turned his head. In the corner of the room, barely illuminated by his shaking flashlight, sat an old wooden chair. On it, with her back to him, sat an elderly woman. The woman slowly turned her head. Her face was a canvas of deep wrinkles, her eyes vacant and soulless. Without moving her lips, the woman's voice echoed directly in Arthur's mind. "You've finally come," the voice whispered. "You cannot imagine how long I've waited for you." Arthur stumbled back, his gaze darting to the mirror. His reflection in the mirror was now smiling, a pained, desperate grin. "I am you," the reflection whispered, its voice strained. "The first to come to this house, the one who made this door and sealed it. But it always finds a way. It always needs a new vessel." In that horrifying moment, Arthur understood. The whispers, the shadows, they weren't trying to scare him away. They were trying to warn him. He should never have opened the door. The old woman slowly rose from her chair. But it wasn't an old woman standing there. Her form stretched, her body twisted, transforming into a towering, shapeless shadow. Arthur scrambled for an escape, but the room had become a sealed tomb. And then, the darkest secret of the story was revealed. Suddenly, Arthur found himself inside the mirror, trapped behind its cold, reflective surface. Outside in the room stood his own body. But the eyes looking back at him were no longer his. In them gleamed the cold, triumphant gaze of the entity that had been imprisoned in that room for centuries. The entity in Arthur's body looked at the real Arthur in the mirror, a chilling smile spreading across his face. "Don't worry," it said in Arthur's voice. "This mansion's restoration will be magnificent. Some old doors, however, need to remain locked forever." The entity in Arthur's body turned and walked towards the room's door. This time, the door opened easily. As it stepped out and relocked the door, it paid no heed to the desperate screams echoing from within, from the man trapped behind the mirror. And so, the restoration project was completed. The mansion stood grander than ever, becoming a popular attraction in the region. People pass by it every day, marveling at its beauty. But no one ever hears the silent screams of an architect, trapped forever behind a locked door within a mirror in the heart of that beautifully restored, cursed mansion. It's about a place, a house in the forgotten heart of the Appalachian Mountains, and how some places remember. The story begins with Elias, a historian seeking absolute solitude to finish his book on American folklore. He rented a secluded two-story farmhouse in West Virginia, miles from the nearest town. The rental agent had been vague about its history, only mentioning it had been empty for a good long while. For Elias, the silence was the main attraction. He thought he had found a perfect sanctuary. He was wrong. The house stood at the end of a long, unpaved road, swallowed by a forest of ancient trees. It was a skeletal structure of faded white paint and a sagging porch, watching him with vacant black windows as he arrived. The air itself felt heavy, still, and old. Here is the continuation of the story. The first week was uneventful, filled with the quiet scratching of Elias' pen on paper and the settling groans of the old house. He established his workspace in the downstairs study, a room lined with empty, dust-shrouded bookshelves. At night, the darkness outside the window was absolute, a solid wall of black that seemed to press against the glass. The silence was profound, broken only by the hoot of a distant owl or the rustle of an unseen creature in the woods. It was during these long nights that the house began to reveal itself. It started subtly, a scent of wood smoke when the fireplace was cold, a faint melody like a child's lullaby, seeming to drift from the upstairs hallway before vanishing when he strained to listen. Elias, a rational man, dismissed it all as his mind playing tricks on him in the deep isolation. Here is the continuation of the story. The psychological unease began to curdle into genuine fear. One afternoon, while searching for a book on the top shelf of the study, his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Prying it up, he found a small, dust-covered wooden box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single photograph in an antique silver frame. It was a family portrait, likely from the early 1900s, a stern-faced father, a weary-looking mother, a young boy, and a small girl. He placed the photograph on the mantelpiece. but every time he glanced at it, he felt a profound sense of being watched. The father's eyes, small and dark in the faded image, seemed to possess a disturbing intensity. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but the feeling grew stronger. No matter where he stood in the room, the father's gaze seemed to be fixed directly on him, cold and possessive. Here is the final, terrifying conclusion to the story. The house grew bolder. Doors would slam shut in empty hallways. The lullaby became clearer, a constant looping melody that frayed his nerves. He started having vivid, disturbing dreams of the family in the photograph. Silent, looping scenes of domestic life that felt unnervingly real. In these dreams, he wasn't an observer. He was the father, his hands feeling rough and unfamiliar, his thoughts filled with a cold, simmering anger that wasn't his own. He packed his bags, deciding to leave at dawn, his book forgotten. The house, however, had other plans. That night, a violent storm broke out, trapping him inside. The power went out, plunging him into a terrifying, suffocating darkness. He lit a candle, and in a moment of pure dread, found himself drawn to the master bedroom, a room he had avoided until now. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, everything preserved as if the occupants had just vanished. On the wall hung a large, ornate mirror, its surface clouded with age. He held the candle up and looked at his reflection. It was his face, pale and terrified. But the man in the mirror was wearing something different. Not his modern shirt and jeans, but a stiff, high-collared shirt and dark waistcoat, the same clothes worn by the father in the photograph. As Elias watched in horror, his own reflection slowly began to change, the features hardening, the eyes turning cold and possessive. The house wasn't haunted by the family. The house was the family. It wasn't replaying its history, it was recasting it, and Elias had just been given his role. He was home.